A sudden statement from Washington has just sent shockwaves across the Middle East. In the middle of an already expanding war, U.S. President Donald Trump issued a dramatic demand, calling on Iran to surrender unconditionally. But that wasn't the only thing that caught global attention. Trump also suggested that the United States should have a say in who becomes Iran's next leader, a remark that immediately intensified fears that the conflict is no longer just about military strikes, but about the future of Iran's entire government. And all of this is happening as missiles, drones, and airstrikes continue to hit targets across the region. So how did the situation escalate this far, and what could happen next? Because the events unfolding right now are rapidly turning into one of the most dangerous geopolitical crises in years. The latest escalation began when President Trump made a bold and highly controversial statement. He said Iran should surrender unconditionally, a phrase rarely used in modern diplomacy and historically associated with the end of major wars. For Iran, this kind of demand is seen as a direct challenge to the country's sovereignty and leadership, and it immediately complicated any remaining hopes for diplomatic negotiations. Markets reacted quickly. Governments across the region began urgent consultations, and analysts started asking the same question: does this signal that the United States is now aiming for regime change in Iran? But to understand why tensions have reached this level, we need to go back to how the war actually began. Because the current conflict didn't start with a speech. It started with a massive military operation. Just days earlier, the United States and Israel launched a major coordinated strike campaign targeting Iranian military infrastructure. Multiple waves of airstrikes hit missile bases, radar installations, command centers, and air defense systems across several parts of Iran. According to Israeli officials, the primary objective was to weaken Iran's ability to launch long-range missiles and drones against Israel and U.S. forces in the region. Satellite images and early reports suggested that several important military facilities were severely damaged during the opening phase of the attacks, but one development quickly overshadowed everything else. Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, was reportedly killed during strikes near Tehran. For more than 3 decades, Khamenei had been the central figure in Iran's political and religious leadership. His death created immediate uncertainty inside the Iranian government. A leadership vacuum in the middle of a military conflict is something that rarely happens, and it instantly raised the stakes of the war. But instead of collapsing under pressure, Iran responded with force. And that's when the conflict began spreading beyond Iran's borders. Within hours of the initial strikes, Iran launched waves of missiles and drones targeting locations across the region. Some were aimed directly at Israel. Others targeted U.S. military facilities and allied bases in nearby countries. Air defense systems across the Gulf region were suddenly activated. Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Kuwait all reported intercepting incoming drones and missiles. Several explosions were reported near military facilities, though many of the projectiles were shot down before reaching their targets. At the same time, regional shipping lanes began experiencing disruptions. Some cargo vessels reported security incidents near critical waterways. Airlines began rerouting flights to avoid potential missile paths. Suddenly, what started as a series of targeted strikes inside Iran was turning into a broader regional confrontation. But that wasn't the only escalation. Another powerful force soon entered the picture: Hezbollah. As tensions continued rising, Israel launched airstrikes targeting Hezbollah positions in Lebanon. The strikes focused heavily on southern Lebanon and parts of Beirut, where the group is believed to operate military infrastructure. Israeli officials said the attacks were aimed at preventing Hezbollah from opening a northern front in the conflict. But the strikes triggered widespread evacuations and displaced large numbers of civilians. Hezbollah has long been considered one of Iran's most powerful regional allies. The group is believed to possess tens of thousands of rockets capable of reaching deep into Israeli territory. If Hezbollah fully enters the war, Israel could suddenly face sustained rocket attacks from the north, while already dealing with threats from Iran, and that possibility has raised serious concerns among military analysts. But even as airstrikes continued, another development began attracting attention behind the scenes. Reports started emerging about a possible new strategy involving Kurdish fighters. According to several reports, the United States has been encouraging Iranian Kurdish groups to challenge Tehran's control in western Iran. These Kurdish groups have had a long and complicated relationship with the Iranian government. Some have fought intermittent insurgencies for years along the mountainous border regions between Iran and Iraq. Now, analysts believe Washington may be exploring the possibility of opening a ground pressure point inside Iran itself. If Kurdish forces were to launch operations against Iranian positions, it could force Tehran to divert military resources away from other fronts, but such a move would carry significant risks. Iran has previously responded aggressively to Kurdish militant activity, sometimes launching cross-border strikes against suspected bases, and a Kurdish uprising could also trigger ethnic tensions inside the country. Still, the idea of a new internal front has added another layer of uncertainty to the situation. Meanwhile, the conflict is already sending shockwaves far beyond the battlefield. One of the biggest global concerns right now is the Strait of Hormuz. This narrow waterway between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula is one of the most important oil shipping routes on the planet. A large percentage of the world's oil supply passes through it every day. If the war disrupts this corridor, the economic consequences could be felt worldwide, and signs of disruption are already appearing. Shipping companies are beginning to reroute vessels. Insurance costs for cargo traveling through the region have surged. Oil prices have climbed as markets react to the growing instability. Airlines are also adjusting flight routes to avoid the conflict zone. At the same time, several governments have begun evacuating citizens from high-risk areas across the Middle East. The United States has moved military assets into the region while organizing evacuation flights for civilians. European governments are doing the same. All of this reflects a growing concern that the conflict could expand further. But despite the rising risks, neither side appears ready to back down. Iranian officials have rejected the idea of surrender outright. Leaders in Tehran say they will continue resisting what they describe as foreign aggression. Meanwhile, officials in Washington have warned that additional strikes remain on the table. U.S. strikes. Military planners are reportedly evaluating further targets inside Iran if attacks against American forces continue. Across the region, militias aligned with Iran are also mobilizing. Groups in Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon are closely watching the situation. Some have already issued warnings that they could join the conflict if the war intensifies. For military analysts, the biggest concern is the possibility of a cascading escalation. If multiple groups across the region become involved at the same time, the conflict could rapidly grow into a much larger regional war. Others believe international pressure could still force a pause in the fighting. Major global powers are urging restraint, while diplomatic channels remain open behind the scenes. But right now, the trajectory remains uncertain. For now, the Middle East is facing one of its most volatile moments in years. A U.S.-Israel military campaign has struck deep inside Iran. Iran has responded with missile and drone attacks across the region. Hezbollah is becoming increasingly involved, and the United States is now demanding Iran's unconditional surrender. Whether this ultimatum is meant as a negotiation tactic or a signal of even larger military plans remains unclear. But one thing is certain, the situation is evolving rapidly. And the next move from either side could determine whether the region moves toward de-escalation or toward a much wider and more dangerous conflict.